The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards settling against the cool night air. Everyone else had gone to sleep hours ago, but I was still awake, restless, my mind unwilling to let the day end just yet. I moved through the dimly lit hallway, padding softly toward the kitchen for a glass of water. The glow from the streetlights outside cast long, golden streaks through the window, illuminating the countertops in a soft, muted light. The air was thick, warm, summer heat still lingering even after the sun had long since disappeared. And then I heard it. A faint sound coming from the garage. I hesitated, setting my glass down, listening more closely. The rhythmic clang of metal, a quiet exhale, the murmur of a low voice talking to himself. I exhaled, shaking my head. Of course. I should have known he'd still be up. I made my way toward the back door, slipping outside into the humid night. The pavement was still warm beneath my bare feet, the scent of oil and metal filling the air as I stepped toward the garage, the soft glow of a single bulb spilling out from the open door. He was there, his back turned to me, bent over the engine of his car, hands streaked with grease, the faint glisten of sweat along the back of his neck. The sight of him like that, focused, shirt hanging loosely over his frame, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, sent a strange warmth curling low in my stomach. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, watching for a moment before finally speaking. "You're still at it?" He glanced up, surprised at first, before a smirk tugged at his lips. "Couldn't sleep." I nodded, stepping inside, the cool concrete soothing against my warm skin. "Guess that makes two of us." His gaze flickered over me briefly, something unreadable behind his eyes, before he turned back to his work. "Didn't think you were the type to wander around the house in the middle of the night." I shrugged, folding my arms across my chest. "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think." A low chuckle. "Maybe." Silence stretched between us, thick and humming with something I wasn't sure either of us wanted to name. The only sound was the quiet clatter of tools, the faint hum of cicadas outside, the occasional deep inhale as he focused on the work in front of him. I shifted my weight, watching the way his fingers moved, the flex of his forearm as he tightened a bolt. "Want to hand me that wrench?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. I blinked, startled out of my thoughts. "Which one?" He smirked, tilting his head toward the toolbox beside me. "The one right in front of you." I reached for it, fingers brushing against cool metal, before stepping closer to him, extending my hand. He took it, but instead of turning back to the car, he held it for just a second longer than necessary, his thumb grazing against my palm before finally letting go. My breath hitched. The air between us changed. He didn't move away, and neither did I. The heat of the garage pressed against my skin, my pulse quickening despite myself. His gaze flickered to mine, lingering there, a silent question hanging between us, thick and unspoken. I swallowed hard, but I didn't pull away. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't leaving this garage anytime soon. The silence in the garage was thick, pressing against my skin like the heavy summer air. The hum of the old light bulb above us filled the space, mixing with the lingering scent of motor oil and warm metal. He still hadn't moved. Neither had I. His fingers flexed once around the wrench before finally setting it down on the workbench. The sound of metal against metal was sharp, grounding, but it didn't break the tension. If anything, it only made it worse. His eyes never left mine. "You should go back inside," he murmured, but there was no conviction in his voice. I swallowed, my fingers curling slightly at my sides. "Maybe?" His smirk was slow, deliberate. "But you won't." I didn't answer, but we both knew he was right. A drop of sweat slid down the side of his temple, trailing along his jaw before disappearing beneath the loose collar of his shirt. I was hyper-aware of every detail, his stance, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the faint scent of soap beneath the grease and metal. The heat between us had nothing to do with the broken fan humming in the background. He exhaled, finally breaking eye contact to reach for a rag, swiping it once over his hands before tossing it onto the workbench. "You're still watching me." I bit the inside of my cheek. You're imagining things. He let out a low chuckle, stepping closer. Am I? The words sent a shiver down my spine, an awareness curling in my stomach that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The weight of his presence was overwhelming now, too close, too much, and yet. I didn't move. His fingers brushed against my wrist, just barely, but it was enough to make my breath catch. I should have pulled away. Should have stepped back, broken whatever this was before it became something else entirely. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. His smirk faded into something else, something heavier, something quieter. Tell me to stop. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my throat. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. His fingers skimmed lower, along the inside of my wrist, slow, deliberate. His touch was barely there, but it burned. Tell me to stop, he said again, softer this time, almost a whisper. The night stretched long and slow between us, thick with something we could no longer ignore. My skin was too warm, my thoughts too scattered. I could still hear my heartbeat when I finally exhaled. But I never told him to stop. And somehow we both knew I never would. A moment passed, then another. The space between us was fragile, hanging by a thread, neither of us daring to move, as if we both knew that the moment we did, everything would change. He exhaled, tilting his head slightly, watching me, waiting. You're still here. So are you. His smirk returned, but it was softer this time, less teasing, more knowing. Guess that means something. I swallowed, the weight of my own breath pressing against my ribs. Maybe? The garage felt smaller now, the air between us thick with something unspoken. The hum of the old fan barely registered, the distant sound of crickets outside fading into the background. All I could hear was the quiet rhythm of my own pulse and the slow, measured inhales of the man standing inches in front of me. He took another step closer, slow, deliberate, like he was giving me time to pull away. I didn't. His fingers lifted again, tracing a slow, light touch along the inside of my wrist before traveling up, barely grazing the sensitive skin of my forearm. Still not telling me to stop. I exhaled, steadying myself. Would it matter? His smirk twitched at the edges, his gaze locked onto mine. No. The honesty sent a slow shiver down my spine. It should have scared me. Maybe it did. But more than anything, it sent a slow heat curling low in my stomach, replacing the doubt, replacing the hesitation. The tension between us was almost unbearable now, pressing down on me from all sides, suffocating and thrilling all at once. I could still walk away. I could still break the moment, pretend none of this had happened, leave the garage and go back to the world where this line hadn't been crossed. But I didn't. Because deep down I knew. It already had been.